Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is When Plants Took Over the Earth, the World of Gymnosperms, with Nat Hab Expedition Leader Eleanor Edye. Thank you so much for being here today, Eleanor. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Brooke, and thanks everybody joining today to talk about gymnosperms, which depending on, how much time you spent with plants and how much time you spent thinking about plants, may be a new topic to you, or it might be one that you're just excited to learn more about. So today what we want to take the next hour to go through is looking at the gymnosperms that exist today that are still on Earth, and then take a step backwards and look at the start of the time of gymnosperms and what kind of evolutionary revolutionizations they had to kind of change the way plants worked on this planet. And not just how they changed the way plant life worked, but the way that they changed the way the planet looked overall. So it is, of course, a big topic. We'll try to keep it on time today, and I will also do my very best to leave some time for questions at the end. As Brooke said, my name is Eleanor, and I'm one of the Canadian expedition leaders. I like plants. It's what I spend most of my time thinking about. And I like taking a step back and looking at historical plant life and historical life in general. If you've listened to any of my webinars before, you might know I've been kind of working my way through some of the big periods of time. And the most recent one that we wrapped up in our kind of great extinction series was the Permian extinction. And while we were talking about the Permian extinction, I introduced the concept of gymnosperms and how they started at that time. And I thought, you know what, before we move forward and talk about more extinctions or anything else, gymnosperms are so special and so unique that it's worth taking the time just to talk about them for a while. So to start off with an overview of what the topic is and what we're talking about, gymnosperms are a group of seed-producing plants. Again, depending how much time you spent thinking about plants, maybe the fact that some plants are not seed-producing is a new thought. Some plants produce seeds, some plants produce spores, and some plants don't actually produce either, and they only reproduce by clonal mechanisms. But gymnosperms are seed-producing plants. The word gymnosperm itself means naked seed or uncovered seed. This group of plants originated in the Carboniferous period, which was between about 360 to 320 million years ago. So we're looking pretty far back here, but well after plants made their way onto land. So the first land plants made their way up around 470 million years ago, so they've had a lot of time to evolve and come up with new mechanisms to survive. And now we're getting to the time of the gymnosperms. Today, there are about 1,000 extant species worldwide, so meaning still currently living. At their height, so during their heyday, there were far more than this, but we recognize about 1,000 species still around today. Of all of the groups of plants, right, if we take these big groups, whether we're talking flowering plants or gymnosperms or mosses or lichens, the big group that has the most extinction threats facing it are the gymnosperms, partially because there are relatively few of them still left, and also because some of them have very restricted ranges and very specific habitat types. So in terms of where they fit in the greater taxonomy of plants, they are what's called a tracheophyte, meaning that they have conducting tissue within their stems. So unlike mosses, unlike liverworts, they have those specialized conducting cells to allow them to grow big and move sugar and fluid around their bodies. They belong to the group of seed plants, the spermatophytes. And then within that, they are the naked seed plants, as opposed to the fruit seed plants, the angiosperms. So these are our two big groups of seed plants, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, where the gymnosperms have the naked seeds, and the angiosperms have their seeds enclosed by fruit. And when we think about trees and most plants, we normally would think about angiosperms because they are certainly the dominant plant group on this planet today, especially in terms of the coverage and size and pretty much every way that you can think about plants. Um, we spend a lot of time interacting with angiosperms. That being said, the gymnosperms still have some special places in our hearts and some special places on this planet. Again, the gymnosperms as a group contain some of the biggest, like the most of all the species, right? The biggest, the widest, the heaviest, the, those with the most volume, the longest lived organisms. These belong to the gymnosperms in terms of what plants are currently around today. And like I said, while they're still living today, they were the dominant plant form about 200 million years ago and have gone through kind of a lowering in where it sits on this planet since, as the angiosperms have taken dominance. So
Eleanor, really
for a
fast.
lot of us, yeah.
Eleanor, I'm sorry to cut you off, but is there any chance you might have another mic that is attached to your computer right now? The current one's a little garbled. If not, that's okay. I just wanted to ask really fast. We're getting a couple comments on it, and I just wanted to quickly chime in.
Let's try this one. Is this one any better?
Yes, that was better. And if there's any other issues, I'll pop back in, but keep on going.
Okay, thank you. Let's try this default microphone. So yeah, please do pop back in if there are any issues, because I know we're using some big words and big concepts in this one here. So I was just saying that for a lot of us, often the starting and ending point of when we start thinking about gymnosperms is when we interact with it either in an economic way or when we bring them into our homes. So this is the holiday season for a lot of people. Many of us will be bringing a spruce or a pine or a fir tree inside our house. And those are, of course, gymnosperms as well. So we actually honor gymnosperms at this time of year during some of our seasonal celebrations. So it seemed like a nice time for a gymnosperm webinar. So let's move on to what gymnosperms represent on the planet today. So when we look at the gymnosperms as a group, there are 4 major groupings within the extant gymnosperms. So we have our cycads, the ginkgo, the neophytes, and the conifers. Some of these might be easily recognized by you, some of them might not. And I'm going to take just a bit of time to go through these big groupings so we can kind of get a sense of what these plants are as we interact with them and as we move around. Overall, the gymnosperms that we talk about, they are mostly woody, meaning that they have secondary growth. They tend to increase in width every year, so they make wood. We interact with wood quite a bit, especially for house construction and things like that, produced by gymnosperms. Many of our gymnosperm species are very important economic plants for wood production. They are all perennial, meaning that they grow year after year after year, getting bigger and bigger, and many of them don't start to produce seeds or start to reproduce sexually until they're, 7, 10, or even older. Meaning that none of them are weeds, none of them are like dandelions, none of them blow in, pop out some flowers, or make some seeds and then disappear next year. So these are long-lived plants that we're talking about. The majority of the gymnosperms are what is called dioecious, meaning that they have 2 homes. So dioecious means that you have separate male and female plants. Although most of our conifers, our cone-producing plants like the pines and the spruces, are monoecious. So monoecious is the same plant with both male and female parts on it. As I mentioned before, there are around 1,000 currently living species. So that's where we find them today, or how many we find today, rather. So there's a few big differences between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms that I wanted to highlight. Part of it is kind of how they grow, and part of it is certainly like how they make their seeds. In terms of how we interact with these plants economically, the big difference that we see is how the wood grows. So in that secondary growth, that widening of a plant stem, Mostly what you're putting on in width is what's called conductive tissue. So tissues that allow water to go up and down the plant, so that you're bringing water from the ground up into the leaves. Now, if you've heard about softwoods and hardwood plants, these are those physical structures that actually differentiate your pines and your spruces from things like your hard walnut. In all of these plants with conductive cells, they have structures that are called xylem. This is the XYLEM that you can see on the screen here. Xylem is our general term for water conducting cells. These are really important, right? If you're thinking about a big pine tree or a big spruce tree, they have all of these needles, they have all of these cells that need a constant supply of water, and they've got to move that water from the ground all the way up the stem to the needles and to the rest of the tissue. And they do this through structures called tracheids. These are long, thin cells with a lot of what are called pits in them that allows the water to be drawn up these cells and delivered to the leaves. In flowering plants, we have tracheids as well, but the majority of the conducting is done through what are called vessel elements or vessel members. And these are actually very big tubes that are very, very efficient at moving water through the plant. So vessel elements or vessel members only move water. Tracheids move water, and they also provide physical support to the plant itself. In a flowering plant, like a walnut or an oak, you're going to have vessel members moving that water super efficiently up and down, as well as tracheids to help support the plant stem. In our softwood plants, like our gymnosperms, we are going to have tracheids only. And what this looks like, and probably what most of us have noticed if you've ever bought anything that's made of wood or cut wood down, is that you end up with very, very different look to the wood. So hardwoods tend to be hard, strong wood. We find hardwoods made by flowering plants, plants that produce flowers and fruit. And our softwood plants are those that are producing, these are our gymnosperms. So if you look here on the left-hand side, the top picture there, that microscope picture, is a hardwood, and you can see all of those tracheids, those supportive cells, are quite densely packed, because all of the water conducting is being done by those big vessel elements, those big pits that you can see in the wood. In our softwood below, those tracheids have to do the job of both being supportive as well as moving water. That allows a lot of open spaces and softness to creep into the wood. And you can see on that lower picture that you can see those tree rings starting there, but a lot of openings within those tracheids, because again, they have to be able to move that water through the supportive tissue. So that's why, like, certainly you get some harder softwoods and some softer hardwoods, but that is why your angiosperms tend to be very, very hardwood, and your gymnosperms tend to have very, very softwood. So that's a major difference that we see between these two plant groups. The other difference, of course, is about the seed and the fertilization. So this is a gymnosperm. If you look up at the top left here, it's a cone, and it's a female cone specifically, because our male and female cones are always going to be separate on these plants. And I want to take some time to look at this fertilization, because we're going to come back to it as one of the things that made this group so successful at the time that they evolved. So gymnosperms, and plants in general, just like humans and other animals, undergo what's called an alternation of generations. So you have just like me, just like you, we have our dominant life stage, the ones where we're up and walking around, or if we're talking about a pine tree, the giant pine tree that's growing. And those dominant life stages are made up of cells that have 2 copies of your chromosomes, right? You've got your mom's and your dad's chromosomes in each cell. Well, a pine tree has 2 copies of their chromosomes too, right? One from the egg and one from the pollen. At the time that they are getting ready to undergo sexual reproduction, they are going to make male cones and they are going to make female cones. Inside the male cones, you're going to have some specialized cells that go through meiosis to produce pollen grains, and those pollen grains will then have a cell that is containing only a single copy of that chromosome. In the female cones, it gets a little more complicated because instead of having just an egg cell that only has a single copy of the chromosomes, they're going to make a whole little home for that pollen to land in what's called they call it the megagametophyte. So it's a part of the plant that grows and has many, many cells in it that certainly contains an egg cell, but it also has a lot of other supportive cells in there as well. So it's a whole living organism, basically, that just gets ready to receive that pollen cell. And then when the pollen meets the egg, they join together and they form part of that seed that's going to grow up to be your next pine tree. Now, this is different than what happens in our flowering plants. So our gymnosperm, that's basically all that happens, right? So on the left-hand side, you've got your megagametophytes, right? It's going to make your egg. You got pollen that lands in there. They go bada bing, bada boom, and you end up with your seed. And that seed is not covered by anything at all. It is, of course, the naked seed, and it's held on top of a specialized leaf, like what we see in those cones there. And our flowering plants, things have gotten a lot more complicated. So flowering plants are a newer evolutionary mechanism. We're here to talk about the gymnosperms, but the angiosperms are worth looking at because we kind of think of this as the default, right? We interact with so many angiosperms that this seems to us the normal way to be. And what the angiosperms have basically done is to take the structures that were found in gymnosperms, so that lovely little structure that supported the egg, and then they've wrapped it up in what is probably a modified leaf in terms of its evolutionary origin, to form a new structure called an ovary. And that ovary is both protective tissue around the egg, and it's the ovary that will actually grow up to become the fruit. So when you cut into a fruit, so say when you're cutting into, I'm going to pick a fruit that you're not going to like, but it's a tomato. A tomato is a great fruit to think about. You've got the seeds inside the tomato. When you cut it halfway, you can see all of the different, you can see that the ovary contains all the different ovules and all of the structures that have been within that plant. And it's a very developed way of carrying your seed somewhere else, right? So in our angiosperms, there's a lot of different ways that those seeds get dispersed, that they get spread around. A lot of them are eaten by animals and then defecated somewhere so that that seed can then spread into a new area. Some seeds are certainly windblown, some seeds are carried on animals. Gymnosperms, the seeds are a lot more delicate because they don't have those protective coatings. And they've put a lot of effort into setting those seeds off with a lot of support. So remember how I said that when the egg is fertilized within the gymnosperm, it's not just the egg, it's the whole little plant that's grown up within that area that then gets fertilized and develops into a seed, basically. So if we think about this in terms of what is most advantageous for a plant, we can think about the way the gymnosperm does it as not necessarily a very smart way for the way things are today. Because if you're going and, you look at a pine cone, and on each of those, each of those modified leaves, the scales of the pine cone, you have a little female plant that's developing, ready to receive pollen. They've put a lot of effort, a lot of calories, a lot of resources into each single potential seed, whether or not it ever gets fertilized. In our flowering plants, if you've ever seen a tomato plant fail to get pollinated, nothing happens, right? It doesn't develop into anything without those seeds being ready and fertilized. So if fertilization doesn't happen in an angiosperm, you really haven't put too much work into that. If fertilization doesn't happen in a gymnosperm, they've already invested a lot of resources into that seed. So that's kind of a real quick breakdown about how our gymnosperms and angiosperms differ. I want to run through the groupings that we just talked about real fast. They're the conifers, the neophytes, the cycads, and the ginkgo. Conifers are our biggest group of currently living gymnosperms, like by a large margin. This single group represents more than 600 living species. They are all cone-bearing plants, so they have the male and the female cones. They are the largest grouping. They are the most economically important group of gymnosperms, and all of those record breakers that I mentioned, like the tallest, the widest, the biggest volume, all come from this group of gymnosperms. And they're found in maybe some surprising places to you. So this map here represents the global distribution of conifer species. If you look up at the northern hemisphere, you can kind of see that olive green going across both North America and Eurasia. That is representing the boreal forest, which is a forest that's made up of nearly 100% of conifer species. So that's where we find the biggest coverage of conifers, but it's not where we find the most species. Every single one of those dots represents 10 species of conifers that are found in those areas. So you can see that while the majority of the coverage of conifers are found in that boreal forest in the northern hemisphere, we still have a lot of our species diversity being found more at temperate and equatorial latitudes. And this is the kind of breakdown of all of the conifers, right? Because I said that they were a really big group. They contain a lot of diversity within this. A lot of them are within the pines, nearly half of, or the pine family, like pines, spruces, and firs, but we also have other groupings within this as well. Probably the most common one that we'll think about is the pine family, the Pinaceae. And this is what you look at if you ever look at a pine when it is starting to produce cones in the early summer. So remember I said that most of our conifers were monoecious, meaning that they have both male and female parts on a single plant. This is the pollen cones up at the top right there, and then you have your seed cone down at the bottom left. These are held separately. The pollen cone's job is to produce pollen. The seed cone's job is to produce those gametophytes that are ready for fertilization and for that pollen grain to hopefully land on them. And if you are allergic to pines, this is kind of a hard thing for you to see in the springtime. I know, because that pollen is produced in huge, huge numbers. The pine group has a lot of specialized adaptations, including adaptations to fire. So this is an example of a pitch pine cone, the female cone containing the seeds, before, kind of right after, and then about a few weeks after being exposed to fire. This is an example of a species that's incredibly fire adapted, and the cones, in fact, will not open until they have been exposed to hot temperatures or fire. This is another important point, along with the fertilization, that we're going to come back to. So it's something to remember that a lot of this grouping contains species that are adapted to not release their seeds until they have experienced fire. The next grouping within the conifers are the cypress families. This includes our junipers and redwoods. Many of these are also fire-adapted species. So if you look at this female cone, or these female cones here, you can see that they're quite sealed up and they have a thick waxy coating on them. This will keep them shut until that wax melts or burns off in a fire. And that is how they disperse their seeds. One of my favorite groups of the conifers is this one. This is what's called a plum pine, or a podocarp. And if you've never traveled to the southern hemisphere and you might not have spent much time thinking about gymnosperms, you might look at this and say, Eleanor, you're crazy. This is not a gymnosperm, and it's not a conifer for sure. You've taken all of my expectations and flipped them upside down. But this is in fact a gymnosperm, and it is in fact a conifer, believe it or not, because aside from the pine and the cypress groups, all of our other families within the within the conifer grouping actually have, instead of those hard scales in their cones, they produce soft, fleshy, sweet, and brightly colored cones, meant to be eaten by birds, which then pass the seeds on their droppings, and sometimes to be eaten by us. This is an example of one that's edible to humans. It serves the same function as fruit in dispersal, but it is a gymnosperm. It does have a naked seed, even though, yes, it is enclosed by that scale, but it doesn't have an ovary surrounding it. It kind of goes to show us the way that nature doesn't exist in tiny little boxes, that this belongs to the same grouping as your spruce and pine trees, even though it looks very, very different. In the theme of things that look very, very different, this is a grouping called the celery pines. Sometimes these are lumped in with our podocarps, the plum pines, like before. And these also occur in the southern hemisphere. They form small to medium-sized trees. They get their name because their leaves kind of look like celery leaves. But if you look at them, you can see they're quite thick and have a nice waxy coating on them as well to reduce water loss. They also produce those fleshy scales that enclose their seeds. One that you might be kind of more aware of here is this is the grouping of yew. And here again, they have those modified seed cones. In this case, they actually make each cone containing a single seed, which is then surrounded by this bright red fleshy scale. And you can see it doesn't fully enclose the seed. And this is pretty normal with our gymnosperm kind of fruit-like structures. These are called not fruits because they're not biologically fruits. We call them arils. And these are, again, meant to be eaten by birds, and then the seeds are dispersed through the bird droppings. With all of our yews, as well as our podocarps, our celery pines, the fruit is edible. The seeds are very, very much not. They are quite toxic, and in case of the yew, there is a lot of toxicity happening in the remainder of the plant to the point that you actually aren't meant to handle the plant without gloves on. So we'll leave those arils for the birds. And then also in kind of the larger groupings of the yew, this is called the plum yew, and it also has that fleshy scale surrounding the seeds. This is endemic in Eastern Asia, this guy here. And then probably my favorite group of conifers are the Araucariaceae, also called the monkey puzzle pines or the bunya pines. They have 3 living genera, and they are ancient trees. They get very, very tall, and they produce these absolutely enormous cones. This is another record breaker here. The female cone of the bunya pine can weigh up to 22 pounds. Which is not a pine that you want landing on your head. And then one more group of pines. These are the umbrella pines, also found in Eastern Asia, specifically in Japan. So that is a look at our conifers, and I think already we're kind of starting to stretch the bounds of what we expected conifers to look like because they are so diverse, even if we don't always see that in North America. Our next big groupings of living conifers are the ginkgos. You might know the herb ginkgo biloba. This is a very, again, ancient grouping. Of everything left in the ginkgo phyta, only the single species remains. So it's a single living example of a group that used to be a lot more widespread. And these were cultivated by monasteries in central China for thousands of years and kind of kept alive in this way. They're often used as kind of ornamental plants in more temperate climates. And they're, again, one of these groups that has separate male and female plants. You will only ever see the male plants planted ornamentally because the female plants are well known for having very, very stinky fruit. But nature being what it is, those male plants will sometimes spontaneously convert to being females so that they can produce seeds as well. So plants like to play with us at every opportunity, it seems like. Our next big grouping is the cycads. So the conifers, the ginkgos, the cycads, 3 out of 4 so far. These guys were also really widespread in the past and much more restricted, especially to tropical areas right now. You might know them by the name cycads. You might know them by the name sago palm. They're also very, very toxic. And they're the only group of our gymnosperms that don't show real strong secondary growth. So they have a different way of growing, and they tend to grow straight up, and they have this kind of hard base of their leaf that is retained in place even after they lose the leaves themselves. So this is an example here that you can see of a male plant. This is a male cone that will produce pollen, and inside the middle of that bigger plant you can see multiple male cones in there. Again, the male and female plants are going to be separate in this group. Also very toxic. And then we come to our last group of currently living gymnosperms, the neophytes. These are very restricted in terms of how many there are and where they live. And they're a really wacky group that has provided in the past a lot of difficulties for taxonomists in terms of how they've been classified. But in general, most taxonomists agree that it belongs to the gymnosperms. They've been thought of whether they were perhaps an early group of angiosperms, so an early group of flowering plants, but we currently think that they belong to the gymnosperms. So this is a plant of ephedra. You might have heard of ephedrine, and pseudoephedrine is kind of all related to this group of plants. You can see the male plants on the left and the female plants with their little cones on the right. Interestingly, this also gives us our earliest record of pollination by another organism. So we know that scorpion flies pollinated an ancient group of neophytes. This is another neophyte, and it is the only gymnosperm that grows as a vine. This is Needham. It grows as a vine, like as a liana. And this is the reason why taxonomists were very confused about where this group belonged, because this group of gymnosperms doesn't just have tracheids for conducting tissue. It also has vessel elements. So very big, very confusing, made a lot of people go back and forth on it for many years, but sperms currently. And then I want to tell you, but if you don't, it is your lucky day, because you are going to learn about Welwitschia. Welwitschia is a genus of plants that is only by itself. There's only one species within this genus, and it is a gymnosperm. You would look at this and think, how does this belong with the pine and the spruce? This particular species is endemic to Namibia and Angola. It's the only living species within this genus. It's the only living genus within the order, and it's often called a living fossil because it's so very, very weird. So after this plant germinates, it produces 2 seed leaves, which grow very, very long. And then those leaves start to break down. And so what you can see here, all those leaf tendrils that seem to be splitting apart, those are 2 single leaves that have become degraded over time to kind of split up and spread out. And they will grow from that growth tissue around the crown of the plant and spread outwards, reaching lengths of up to about 13 feet in the bigger plants. In this plant, you can see around the crown of this plant is where the cones are produced. And this is a male plant. Again, having male and female plants in the species is the more common way for gymnosperms to live, once we take the conifers out of the ranking. So that is a look at our gymnosperms as they are currently living. Some probably what we expected, some probably a little bit more wacky than we were thinking of. So let's now look at this within the larger evolutionary context, because this is just so interesting. This is a simplified diagram, but it really gets across some really interesting points and important points about the large evolutionary groups of plants and what those big game changer evolutionary gains were to make these plants possible. right? Our first plants that ever existed were aquatic plants. They were things like green algae. There was a major evolutionary revolution to give us what's called a cuticle, so a protective structure around the plant to allow for no water loss. That gave a rise to species like and groupings like the mosses and the liverworts. These are small plants. They were the first land plants that we know of. And then later on, at some point, we had another major evolutionary revolution that produced vascular tissue. So the ability to move water and sugars around the plant, not just through osmosis, but through active conduction, gave rise to plants like the ferns and the lycophytes. And those were some of our first land plants that had conductive tissue. And then we come to what we're talking about now. And here it shows us as seeds being the main evolutionary change between the ferns and the gymnosperms. And we're going to talk in a second about how that's not the only thing that's happened, but it was certainly a big, big thing, right? The full story of pine reproduction, right, starts with the story of seeds. Seeds were an incredibly successful evolutionary innovation because they took a process that depended on, a spore landing on wet soil, not drying out, starting to grow. And then instead of that poor little spore having to put everything together and get all of those nutrients from the environment as it's a single cell, the seeds took all of those needs and packaged them up into a single structure so that now they can just drop seeds, and those seeds contain everything that those plants are going to need to grow into little baby plants and go on and be successful. But that was not the only thing that these plants did differently, and it wasn't the only thing that made them successful. I was talking before about how these plants get fertilized and, how the pollen comes to the egg and everything comes together and boom, you've got a seed. Well, that's kind of the short story. I want to tell you how it was before that, because before we had pollen and before we had, our megametophytes sitting on the scales of a cone, we had things like ferns, we had things like lycophytes, we had mosses. And these plants went through this same alternation of generations where they have a diploid and a haploid organism. But if you've ever grown ferns, you've probably noticed that around the base of the ferns growing in the soil are these kind of what we call a thallus structure, like we can see here in the bottom left on your screen. This structure is the gametophytes, the haploid phase of the fern. If you don't have that, you don't get the big grown-up fern. This is a very important phase in a fern's life cycle. And it's on that very small, flat-growing thallus that it's going to produce eggs and sperm. And then that sperm has to find a droplet of water, start swimming, and swim its way over to find an egg cell. And then once the sperm and the egg come together, then you can have an adult fern. But without that thallus producing the sperm and egg, and without the water in place to let that sperm swim through, you are not going to end up with your adult fern because you haven't had that fertilization take place. So what that can tell us is about the ancestors of our gymnosperms, our lycophytes, our ferns, our mosses, and liverworts. All of these plants were found close to water. They were all found in really nice habitats with frequent rain. Because without rain, without that access to water, they were not able to fertilize because they were dependent on water and sperm that had to swim through that water. With our conifers, we've talked about pollen, and we've talked about how if you're allergic to conifers, you're going to have a hard time in the spring because so much pollen is produced, because that is no longer dependent on water for fertilization. Interestingly, we do see still in our currently living gymnosperms, some of them at least, an intermediate phase. So in our cycads and in our ginkgos, we have pollen being produced in the male cones that then is usually carried by wind over to the females, or in a few rare cases, it might be carried by a beetle. And then that pollen lands on the seed-producing area, the megagametophyte. The pollen tube grows out from the pollen cell, but then in the case of the ginkgos, it will open and then release these swimming sperm to go find the egg. And this is our intermediate step here between our plants like the ferns and the lycophytes that were entirely dependent on having water around, and then our plants like the conifers that don't require that at all. They have no swimming sperm whatsoever. They have pollen that lands, the pollen grows a tube, and then the haploid cell, the male cell, will come out at the end of the pollen tube. No flagella, no swimming, no water required for that at all. And then we have things like the cycads and the ginkgos where there's just like only that internal water is required for those still swimming sperm. So seeds were this incredible innovation, but I would say to you that even more important for that innovation was moving away from needing free water for fertilization of these plants. So here we have kind of our track of gymnosperms here. And if you look at the left-hand side, these are our gymnosperms. You can ignore the angiosperms off to the right. We don't care about those flowering plants. But it kind of, all of these kind of bright yellow colors are the ones that are still living today. So our conifers, the nedums, the ginkgos, and the cycads. And then we have a number of other groups that did not make it through until today, but they were still very, very successful in their own times. And certainly showed a lot of these same innovations that our currently living gymnosperms showed. So these innovations, these productions of seed, the lack of need for water to have fertilization, and then other things like, you know, thick waxy coatings on the leaves. It completely changed the way plants were able to exist on the landscape. And this was really important for them at this time because they were facing a lot of problems, a lot of hardship at the time when gymnosperms evolved. So before the gymnosperms, let's take a step back into this here is early Triassic. Beautiful water, lots of big ferns, some lycophytes growing around. Our plants were really restricted to those easy areas close to water because, like we said, without water, they were not able to have fertilization. Global temperatures were cool and comfortable. And then a number of things changed. The first thing that changed was the planet itself, because we came to the time of Pangea. And when our continents all moved together into this area and made this supercontinent, it changed a lot of the way the oceans moved. It changed the way that the planet heated. And we had all of these coastal areas, but then the whole center of this enormous landmass was hot and dry. There was some other things going on with the climate then as well. But overall, this lovely planet that had been cool, relatively lush with lots of precipitation changed to this incredible hothouse where ocean temperatures were upwards of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, where land temperatures were well beyond that. These are very challenging conditions for plants, and they were impossible conditions for plants that depended on free water for fertilization. So there was a really, really strong pressure on the evolutionary mechanisms of plants at this time. What looking at the ancient genomes has told us is that what likely happened at this time was something called a whole genome duplication event, where either through hybridization or through a failure to undergo meiosis during the fertilization process, instead of a plant having a copy of the genes from the mom and a copy of the genes from the dad, they got 2 copies from each. So we had, instead of 2 copies of chromosomes in the adults, they had 4. And this has happened a number of times, both with plants as well as with animal evolution. We think it happened in the human evolutionary history as well. And one of the things that a whole genome duplication event lets you do is it gives you bigger organisms with bigger cells, lots more chromosomal material, and more genes to choose from. And it often lets evolution happen in a much faster pace than it otherwise might. So we had these incredible pressures on plants to adapt to this hot, dry, arid environments. And they did. It's not that we stopped having lycophytes and we stopped having ferns, but we now went on to have this whole new group of organisms that did not require water for fertilization, that did not require water for dropping their spores into to have this perfect little system. They were able to produce seeds, and these seeds might last a year or 2 or 10 years after they were produced, waiting for the perfect time to grow. So they were really, really well adapted for these very challenging conditions that existed here at the end of the Permian. So if we look here, we can see that, I have this orange box here around the Permian. Right before that was the Carboniferous. Our top blue line here shows us our average temperature. The bottom green line shows us how much carbon there was in the atmosphere. So when conifers were starting to evolve, temperatures were relatively cool through the Carboniferous before they started to spike upwards in the Permian, and they had to get real good at living in the heat and the dry really quickly. And we also had a lot of plant growth start in the Carboniferous when these plants were starting to evolve and taking up more and more and more carbon from the atmosphere. And then there was a big die-off in the Permian. Lots of plants died for a lot of other reasons, including some supervolcano activity. And some of that carbon that was absorbed by plants was then released back into the atmosphere. So our gymnosperms really came about through this incredible pressure and crunch time at this time of change from cool and damp to hot and dry. And of all of the organisms that made it through the Permian extinctions, which if you watched a previous webinar was really the time where we didn't know if the Earth was going to survive, right? There were incredible pressures. Nearly all of the life died in the seas. Nearly all of the life died on land. But you know what didn't die? The gymnosperms, because they were adapted for those really, really challenging conditions. And that is still where we see them today, right? We see gymnosperms living in pretty marginal environments. You go somewhere cold and dry, you're going to find a gymnosperm. You go somewhere hot and dry, probably going to find a gymnosperm there too. You go somewhere where a flowering plant doesn't want to grow, you're probably going to find a gymnosperm able to live in that environment. Something else that gymnosperms had to deal with and had to develop adaptations for was fire. This image here is showing us, the red line there is oxygen concentration in the atmosphere, and the white line running across is our present oxygen level. At the time of the Permian, right, where we start to get heating, and we had these gymnosperms starting to spread across the land, this is also when we started to see the first really extensive forest fires, both because we had more oxygen in the atmosphere, and it was also very hot and dry. And we know just from living here and now that when you have hot and dry with lots of oxygen, you're going to probably have a forest fire. Well, this was not any different back when they first evolved. Oxygen levels were higher than now, so things would have been even faster to burn. And all of these plants, as they were starting to diversify and grow and make it through this time, also then had to develop things like adaptations to, for example, have cones that wouldn't open to let their seeds out until after a fire had gone through, because that is when we then see openings available for those new plants to grow. They were things like, for example, what we see now in some gymnosperms where they have specialized resin cells that actually help them burn faster and hotter to then allow the forest to clear out to allow room for their offspring to grow. So our forest fires that we see today that are all happening in forests dominated by gymnosperms really come from the first time that gymnosperms evolved and the pressures that they were facing at that time. And they have given us some of these fire-dominated landscapes that we still see today where we have gymnosperms. So the world before the gymnosperms, this lovely area where we had a lot of, dry upland areas where there was no vegetation because nothing could live there, to this world that we have now where the gymnosperms have evolved and they've spread out across the planet, right? They have taken every habitat because they are able to. They're not limited by water. They're not limited by poor soils like some of our previous plants were. And they have made these landscapes that are designed to burn and require fire for regeneration. So they have kind of, even though we're talking about a period in time that's 250 million years ago, we still see echoes of that time in how our world works today because of what the selection pressures were on these organisms. And on top of that, if that wasn't enough for how gymnosperms affect your life today, a lot of these plants that grew during the Carboniferous and during the Permian are what we're currently putting in our cars and in our engines as fuel, because it was this big push of plants that moved around all of our land in the Permian that then went on to become the hydrocarbon reserves that we have today. So you can thank gymnosperms for a number of things, right? You can thank them for being your friends and being your Christmas tree. You can thank them for opening up all of this new habitat, for being the precursor to the plants that we eat, our angiosperms. But we also have to be aware that this, all of these things that happened in the past, these selection pressures, have still changed the way our world is today, because there's still such a dominant life form in some of those marginal habitats that we see forest fires and we see all of these things that echo back to these older times. So if we're thinking about how they've changed the world, you can thank them for all of those things. You can thank them for being long-lived, for taking so much time to grow, right? Because they are so long-lived and they grow so slowly because they're in such poor habitats, they've left the good habitat at this point to our flowering plants, but we still find them in all of these more challenging habitats, as well as through some of the nice areas as well, like in the tropics. But when we think about our areas in the high north, for example, we're always going to think gymnosperms. Live slow, die never, as opposed to live fast and die young. They are there and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. So they're pretty special plants. I hope we have kind of opened your mind to them a little bit in this past hour. And we've got a few minutes here for questions. I'd love to pop things back to Brooke here.
That was the perfect quote to end it on. Live long, die never. That was fantastic way. That should be like their motto, Gymnosperms are tied up or in one phrase. That was perfect. So everyone, we will take questions for a few minutes. I know we are towards the end here, but I do have some. And if there's anybody else that would like to pop their question in their control panel, go ahead and do that. We do have a couple questions about that fascinating Namibian gymnosperm that you talked about. Could you please spell it for us? And can you also maybe talk a little bit more about how it survives? How does it get water? How does it get the things that it needs to prosper?
Oh, of course. I'm just going to scroll back. Oh, there we go. Because I think you can never look at Welwitschia enough, right? It's such a weird looking plant. And it just takes away from all of our expectations of what we expect for a gymnosperm to look like, and kind of a plant in general, right? So Welwitschia is spelled Welwitschia, Welwitschia. And this, like I said, is endemic to the Namib Desert, but I've been lucky enough to see it at a at a botanical garden. And I know I've got some friends who have been able to grow it in New Mexico. So you can get your hands on it if you live somewhere that is likely to survive. It is a plant that you can source and you can put in your own garden if you live in a similar type of environment. And really, it shows a lot of the same adaptations that other gymnosperms do as well. So while I'll leave us with this picture of Welwitschia, I'd actually like you to imagine a pine tree in your head, right? So pine trees or spruce trees are some of the trees that we find in also really marginal environments, right? The last trees as you go north into the tundra, the last trees as you go up a mountain. And while they might not be contending with the heat that Welwitschia does, they contend with the dryness because a lot of the time all of the water is frozen and they don't have access to water. So while it looks really, really different in Welwitschia, a lot of those same adaptations come into place with how these plants exist. So a lot of our gymnosperms have a very deep, what's called a taproot. So it reaches pretty far down, it anchors down, and it's able to collect water when water exists. And then often those taproots can store some water as well for times that are more dry. Nearly all of our gymnosperms have very, very thick cuticles. And the cuticle is the waxy layer that exists on top of the leaf. Welwitschia is no different than that. But again, if you picture a pine tree and you picture it how hard that leaf is, that needle, which is a type of leaf, it is because of that thick waxy substance that exists on that. So it's not losing water to the atmosphere. And that's, again, what Welwitschia is doing. So this is one I am fairly certain, though I'm not 100% certain, that this is also a wind-pollinated species, but it's a neophyte, so sometimes weird things happen with this, and there might be insects involved in this one as well. You can see that central part, we call that sometimes a trunk, even though it's not growing upwards, and all of the growth is happening around the outside of that apical area. And yeah, I hope that's what you wanted to hear, because man, it's an oddball, right? To see those cones and that ring around that the apical meristem there, and to have those two leaves that then stretch outwards for 12 feet and just break up and become all raggedy. I tell you, if I lived somewhere that was dry and hot enough, I would have a few of these in my garden, because they're one of my favorite plants solely because how odd they look. They're pretty great.
Absolutely. We actually have some comments in here of someone who they actually got to see them in the Namibian desert, which was cool. And another comment of when someone was at our bear camp that they saw so much pollen that it looked like a fog bank. So lots of firsthand experiences with gymnosperms, which is very awesome. I think this last question is probably the best way to wrap this up is why have a lot of gymnosperm species gone extinct? Why have they disappeared?
Yeah, that could be a talk in and of itself, but part of it is that species do go extinct, right? A species has an average lifespan on this planet that's usually estimated between 2 and 3 million years. Some last much less time than that. Some last much more time than that. So even the species of gymnosperm that we see today, we would fully expect that in some length of time, they will not be here anymore, or they'd be replaced by a different similar species that fills that same niche. In a lot of cases with the gymnosperms, it comes down to available habitat. So when the gymnosperms were dominant, they had the entire continental landmass basically to themselves, because nothing else could compete with the gymnosperms. They had the good bits and they had the hard bits, right? They had the deserts and they had the nice areas. And these days, the angiosperms, our flowering plants, really have taken over all of those nicer niches. You know, you go to those biodiversity hotspots, right? You go to a tropical rainforest, and there may be, need them, right? You may run into a couple of gymnosperms, but in those areas that have lots of water, that have lots of sun, that have lots of nutrients, the angiosperms are just going to win because they are so much faster at going through their life cycle than gymnosperms are. We have a lot of weedy angiosperms that come in and reproduce super fast. We have some that are just quite dominant, that just are able to access those areas faster. Gymnosperms, to go through their life cycle, right? A lot of them don't start reproduction until they're 7 to 10 years old. And in some of our species, between the time that they start to grow those cones, it might be 3 years until you get a seed. It comes down to that, live slow mentality that gymnosperms seem to have. So they outcompete the angiosperms in all of those poor habitats, but they are not as strong as the angiosperms in the good habitats because they're not fast enough. They're never going to be the dominant life form when you're up against a plant that has the ability to make fruit, to grow quickly, to move water through all of its conducting tissues the way angiosperms do. So they're still really economically dominant for us, but they can just no longer hold on to that habitat since the evolution of the flowering plants.
Absolutely makes sense. Competition is a real thing. Well, fantastic, Eleanor. I think that will be the last question that we will take today. So I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Hey, thanks everybody for coming by today. I hope that no matter where you started with your knowledge of gymnosperms, that there's been something new that's come at you today. And selfishly, I hope that everybody who can will go out and plant a Welwitschia, just so I can have more chances of seeing them in the world. And thank you again. And we'll continue on with a series of mass extinctions in the future, but we couldn't let the Permian go without talking about the gymnosperms. They're pretty great. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you, Eleanor, for teaching us, just like you said, about that tree that is in most of our homes right now. So thanks for that. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.